So we know we can use variables and constants in JavaScript to store individual bits of data, but there are times when it makes sense to group collections of data together. Like in this example here, I have variables for each bit of data for these two different albums, but it would be better if I could group these four variables together into a container variable that would represent an entire album. Luckily, there is just such a container in JavaScript. We call it a JavaScript object. An object can be assigned to a variable just like any other piece of data. So I'm going to create a variable called album, and I will assign an empty object to that variable. I let JavaScript know that I want this to be an object by using curly braces. I like to think of these braces as creating sort of a little box or package that I'm going to put other things into, because the difference between an object and a normal variable is that an object can hold many values instead of just one, and it can even hold values of different types. So I can actually put all of these variables for my album inside of the object that I've just created. So now I have an object called album that contains all these other variables. Some are strings and some are numbers. Now you can see I'm getting an error over here because this isn't actually the proper syntax for creating an object. I don't actually need the let keyword for any of these. I need it for album because that's the variable I'm creating. But these ones inside aren't actually their own variables anymore. They're properties of this album object. So I only need to use let on the album variable. Also, inside of objects, we don't use the equal sign to assign values to the properties. We use a colon. I'm not exactly sure why. The last change we have to make is to add a comma after each property in the object. Great, so no more error, and now when I use my album variable anywhere in my code, I can see I'm getting this whole object with all the properties inside it. But what if I want to access just one of these properties? How can I get to just the album name out of this object? We can do that by adding a dot followed by the property name we want to access. The dot lets me reach inside of this object and access any of its properties individually. So I can get the album name or the artist or the year or the rating out of this object. Now that I have these properties inside of my album object, it seems silly to have to say album.album1 year. So I'm going to actually rename these all to just say name, artist, year, and rating. So now I can just say album.name to reach inside that album object and get the name property. And if I make another object for my second album, I can make the properties inside it have the same names, so I can get an individual property from either object in the same way. I just need to say album1.name to get the name from the album1 object, or album2.name to get the name from the album2 object. So that's a very quick intro to JavaScript objects. To summarize, I'll say an object is a variable that can contain multiple named properties inside of it, and those properties can be of different types.